Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hi, mate. How you going?
Very good. So we're on the debt subject today.
So the last couple of years when we've been doing these shows, we've spoken a lot about the household debt bubble that Australia has. We've talked about the foreign debt problem that we have. One of the problems that are emerging in some of the state governments is the balance sheets of some of the state governments around the country. So today I want to focus on Queensland. Queensland lost its AAA credit rating in February of 2009. The deficit under the Bligh government was running out of control. You had a change of government in 2012 with a premier who wanted to actually fix the problem, took a very aggressive approach to getting the debt deficit sort of situation under control in Queensland. The people ultimately didn't want to take that medicine in 2015, and Campbell Newman lost power. Now we have the Palaszczuk government who's been in power since 2015. What we have seen in 2019 is that the Palaszczuk government has handed down a new budget. We're seeing red ink over the next 4 years. So just to sort of set the scene for today's conversation, and we have a special guest that we're going to have a conversation about the Queensland situation. In 2011-12, so this is June of 2012, Queensland's debts was about 61 billion. So the size of the economy, it was about 20.2%. As of June of last year, in terms of the debt of Queensland, has increased by about 6 billion. Now, over that time period, the size of the Queensland economy has grown by 50 billion. So that's why the Queensland debt as a proportion of the economy, which is gross state product, has fallen to 18.9. But we've seen a commitment by the Palaszczuk government to increase debt going forward by about another 15 billion going out to 2022 to 2023. And when you look at the credit ratings, in terms of the rating agencies, we have Standard & Poor's and Moody's has given Queensland their second highest rating. And we have Fitch has given them a AAA rating, which is their third highest rating. So not AAA, which they lost in 2009, but the rating seems pretty okay. Now, one of the concerns that you and I have had when we spoke about this off camera is one of the reasons why Queensland is still getting reasonably good marks from the rating agencies is that we have low interest rates, and so we're seeing this growth of debt, but we're seeing low interest rates. So the interest cost on the debt has been falling because of these low interest rates, and so everyone's been talking about that the interest rates are in terms of the interest and the debt, it's serviceable because the interest costs are relatively low. But one of the things that we've been talking about is that we're headed towards dicier economic times moving forward. So whether it could be higher rates or whether it could be some sort of economic shock, a financial crisis, some sort of a deep economic recession, and my concern is that with Queensland is their balance sheet is not set up for a more troublesome economic environment.
So, John, very important question then. Who is our guest?
We have the former Premier of Queensland, Campbell Newman, who was actually the politician trying to resolve this debt and deficit crisis between the years of 2012 and 2015. So Campbell has generously agreed to come and talk about the state, the situation in the state of Queensland, and we have him here today.
Yeah, Campbell, welcome, and thank you very much for spending some time with us. I think this is a very important conversation, not least, as John said, because the economic backcloth of the economy, both at the state and the federal level, looks a little bit more dodgy now. But I'd like to take you back to 2012 and basically ask you, when you came into office there, what did you find? And firstly, was it as you expected? And secondly, what challenges were you confronted with?
Thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be involved because this is a critically important issue. When we got into office, we commissioned Peter Costello, the former Howard government treasurer, to oversee a commission of audit. But of course, in the early days anyway, we were getting the briefings from the key parts of the state government on the fiscal position. And it was particularly bad. And it was really the trajectory that we'd been handed by the Bligh-Fraser administration, which was really starting to get ahead of steam. And that was significant extra debt because of ongoing fiscal deficits. So really they had blown the operating budgets, if you like, of the state government to an unsustainable level. And as I used to say, just to illustrate the point, literally we were borrowing to meet operational expenses, putting petrol into police cars, paying the wages budget. Borrowing was occurring just to do that because the public sector was too high. And that's why we had to take urgent and quite decisive action.
A relatively significant challenge then. And I guess I'm interested in the process that you went through in terms of, getting information on the table. You mentioned the Costello review. What did your own Treasury people also put on the table in terms of options?
Well, the incoming brief to government, as I recall, was particularly worrying. I'm not going to beat around the bush. It said there was a huge problem. To be frank, the Costello exercise with people like Mr McTaggart, a former under-treasurer, very well respected in Queensland government circles. I mean, that was a document that really pulled together everything, looked more broadly and looked to the future, probably more than Treasury and some of the departments would normally do. So that really looked to the long-term sustainability of government. But whichever way you cut it, it was a very concerning picture. As it continues to be, well, it's actually even worse today. So we got going straight away. I mean, because we had to, hand down a budget in 2012. So straight away we, put our hand down and reached that handbrake and really pulled hard. And the Costello report came, as I recall, probably about a year after we were in government, and that really looked to the longer term things. But what we tried to do up front was put a brake on the normal budgetary spending that was going on. We've immediately put a freeze on hiring the public sector, and we looked across government for savings, any savings that we could generate.
And my question there is, Campbell, was the AAA rating something which was sort of centre of mind, or was that, if you like, a consequence of other strategies that you adopted?
Well, look, the AAA credit rating is, if you like, an important, message from the financial markets about where an administration or indeed a company's going. That wasn't something that I, by the way, spent my time agonising about, and certainly going on a pathway to try and get it back. Yeah, great. But again, that wasn't my sort of driving motivation. My motivation as Premier, working with my Treasurer, Tim Nichols, was to actually get the budget on a sustainable footing, to be able to deliver the vital frontline services like hospitals and schools and police, fire, ambulance, etc., and be able to do those things, but not be heading further into the abyss. So that's how I approached it. And there's a lot of nonsense talked about what we did when we were in office. And the Labor Party have continued to talk about cuts all the time. And I want to reflect on the LNP in a moment, the way they've dealt with that. But the thing about the cuts is we did not cut frontline services. And indeed, the statistics demonstrate that you actually can, tighten the belt in a state administration and yet still produce better results in hospitals and schools, ambulance services, fire and police. You can do it through better management, through a focus on better outcomes, rather than just this mantra we have these days, which is if there's a problem, pump more money into it and it will be fixed. I mean, education is a case in point. We saw some really interesting stats recently about the ACT schools. They've had record funding year after year, continues to go up. The scores have gone down in terms of NAPLAN. So, if you talk about management, efficiency, better leadership, you don't actually need to just pump more money.
So in terms of your first budget, when I had a look at the Commission of Audit report preparing for this interview, the Commission of Audit talked about a two-stage strategy. The first stage was that with your first budget, you were looking to basically make savings of about $5.5 billion over 3 years. Now, of that $5.5 billion, about $3.5 billion was spending cuts. There were some tax measures or revenue measures, and there were some cuts to capital investment. What the Commission of Audit said was that to regain the AAA, Queensland needed to cut debt in the order of 25 to 30 billion. And they basically said that the only way that was possible was through privatisation, because there was an initiative from the Abbott government around asset recycling. Before you came into office, did you understand the enormity of the challenge, or did you, communicate a message to the electorate coming into the election, and then when you actually became Premier and you were sat down and looked at the numbers and took technical advice, you realised that the challenge was harder than what you had even thought and what the people of Queensland thought?
Oh, look, I might answer that latter part first. Absolutely, that was the case, because it's on the public record. I made a statement about the public service and people not having to be concerned about us prior to getting in the chair, and that was dead wrong, and it was because we didn't really see the grim facts. And so when we got into office, we did downsize. We let 14,000 people or so go, and by the way, they weren't sacked. That's again another one of the misnomers and nonsense that gets talked about. They were all given very generous redundancy packages, and it was a voluntary redundancy program. So we did though downsize, and that just demonstrates that we thought we knew prior to the election. Once we got into office, we realised that we really had to step on the brake. So going to that first budget was particularly difficult because we had so many quite unpopular decisions to make. I suppose that, in some quarters wasn't well received. I mean, if we're going to talk later on about the politics of this, it might surprise you. I actually don't think these decisions necessarily were the reason that we lost. And I think one of the big problems of the 2015 LNP loss is that so many people from the Conservative side, not just in Queensland but nationally, have taken the wrong messages. There were many reasons for our loss, and it was a narrow loss, but it wasn't. You can't just say it was we were proposing to sell assets or we cut 14,000 public servants. Frankly, I don't think, for example, that the downsizing ultimately caused us to lose an election. Lots of people like to say that, but it's not true. It's rubbish. Then there are many things we could have done apart from that to correct other issues that we got into that would have meant that we would have won that election. We lost the election at slightly under a two-party preferred vote of 50-50. In today's sort of political environment, that's actually not too bad. But a loss is a loss, of course.
And there was a focus group, I think, after that loss. And one of the things that did come out was that there were a lot of people in Queensland who believed that more debt was okay, and that really, it wasn't a critical issue. So there seems to be a fundamental, if you like, disconnect between essentially the policies that you were advocating and what the perception in the community was.
Well, firstly, I've actually never been privy to that sort of research that you've alluded to. I'm not even sure who did that, but I'll say this, that I do agree that I don't think the community ever got, and still I believe that's the situation. They don't get the magnitude of the problem. I don't believe that people connect state government debt and deficit with impacts in their lives, and that's problematic. I think people don't sort of get that for example, high land tax, high stamp duty charges actually do impact on, and of course they do. They're a burden on the economy, and they are built into the cost base of the cup of coffee you buy or the apartment we rent. It's all there, and I suppose it's my fault and my team's that we didn't do enough of joining the dots for people. On the issue of asset recycling, that's quite an interesting one. I often pondered this. Well, firstly, I should just let you know something, and this is a matter of the public record as well. I was very, very concerned about putting this forward. So within any government, there's different points of view, and the leader's job is to bring people together and keep them together. My treasurer, Tim Nichols, was a big proponent of asset recycling. I was very concerned about it, and in one particular party room meeting, I really personally had to sort of head off a decision by the party room by all those LNP MPs who were ready to back the Treasurer to sell the whole damn lot. And I thought that was going to be politically untenable. So I was always very concerned about it. Frankly, I'd have preferred to have adopt a much slower approach to trying to get some of these things done. From a governance point of view, I got it. Of course, I got it. But from a political point of view, I thought it was going to be very, very difficult. So in the end, what we put forward was a compromise. But if you ask me what the particular problem with the politics of it was, on the one hand, we were saying there's a big problem and that we needed to sell or lease assets. And we were talking about paying down debt. But then during the election campaign, we quite perversely, in my view, reflecting on it now, we're saying, oh, by the way, because we're doing that, we're going to build this. We're going to give you a new school. We're going to do this motorway flyover. We're going to upgrade this road. So, and I think there's a real disconnect. I think it was false. I think on the one hand we were saying, we've got to tighten the belt. We've got to reduce debt. But then we were saying, hey, if we sell these things or lease these assets, look at all the goodies you'll get. And I think that was viewed with some suspicion deep down inside. I think voters went, hey, this doesn't sound quite right. All the goodies being handed out, but they've been saying this. Do you see my point?
Yes, absolutely. So is there do you think, a fundamental disconnect between how individuals reflect on those messages, or do you think they actually are a bit more sassy than many people give them credit for, and actually can sometimes see when there is that contention between, if you like, those 2 points of view?
Look, I think the problem is, just go back to Tours, I think the problem is that people don't see that a very poor fiscal situation in Queensland is ultimately hurting them. I don't think they make that connection. I don't think they think it affects them. And that's the trick where I think political leaders actually have to make the case better about high stamp duty means higher cost of buying your first home or buying your second home or whatever, or for your kids, or higher land tax means your coffee shop is ultimately, they might have legislation that says the coffee shop doesn't pay land tax, but ultimately it gets factored into the rent. So it's arguments like that which are harder to make. But I don't believe people get the seriousness of the situation, because ultimately it will completely undermine the ability of the state administration in Queensland to deliver services that people expect. That's the ultimate sort of train wreck that's in front of us.
Campbell, I just want to go back to one of the points that Martin made previously. So when I have been, having been a former coalition advisor down in Canberra, it was about 12 months ago, I had a conversation with a Queensland federal coalition MP. And in terms of this focus group research that Martin referred to earlier, so what I was told was that after you lost in 2015, the LNP themselves, the party apparatus, did a series of focus groups with Queensland voters and asked Queensland voters point blank in terms of, what's your attitude about in terms of Queensland's debt? What's your attitude about the attitudes of the Newman government to addressing this problem? And what I was told from this federal MP was the research showed that a lot of Queenslanders did not accept responsibility for the government's debts. They say, I have my debt, as in my mortgage, my credit card, my car loan, whatever, but the government's debt is the government's debt. I have nothing to do with that. And a lot of Queenslanders were effectively, like Pontius Pilate, washing their hands away from any responsibility around that debt. So that was one of the key messages that was coming through from this first focus group testing. But the other thing that I was told was, for those Queenslanders that did accept that there was a problem, they didn't want to accept the policy measures that your government was putting forward to actually in terms of trying to resolve the issue. So that's why I thought today's show was important, was because, in terms of my view, so it doesn't matter if it's a federal government or a state government, citizens have to accept that if a government is incurring debt, that debt is basically the debts of the citizens. The citizens will ultimately have to pay that back in one form or another, whether it's through cuts in services or higher taxes or whatever the case may be. So it's wrong in a democratic society for citizens to be able to wash their hands and say, the politicians are doing that, I had nothing to do with that, it's not my problem. I think people have to say, well, we elect these politicians. If the politicians are racking up debt, with that, I've got to pay that back. And we need more responsible politicians who are actually going to manage better finances. So that's point one. But actually point two is, for those people who said, I accept there's a problem, but I don't accept the measures that the Newman government offered. I mean, how many options did you actually have? So, I mean, because you talked about 14,000 public servants, and that had a big impact with short-term unemployment in terms of Brisbane. So did you have a lot of options to actually address the problem, or really it was that you had to basically cut back office services in terms of public servants? You had to basically try to privatise some assets, and there was nothing really else that you could do to actually overcome the challenge you faced in between 2012 and 2015?
Well, it depends on what your objective is. If your objective was to get the AAA credit rating back, you actually had to reduce debt by selling assets. It's the only way to do it. Only way you could do that, selling or leasing assets. As I said earlier on, that actually wasn't my personal objective. Might have been Treasury, might have been the Treasurers, but that wasn't my personal objective. Mine was to get it back into, at least balanced budgets and a sustainable future. I would have then preferred to just have an approach which would have said, well, in the long term, let's just keep a lid on spending, and ultimately, as the economy grows, as the budget grows, with good management, get to a much stronger position, and while holding the levels of debt stable. That would have been a good outcome as far as I'm concerned. So I think that was the other way you could have done it. But I was alluding before, you had essentially within the government, you had a group who were pushing very hard that we have to take these sort of measures, and ultimately that's what drove the proposal to put forward some of this asset leasing program. Now, let me just be very, very clear. I think that the 14,000 public servants, voluntary redundancy program, I don't think that in itself was a sort of election killer for us. If that's all we'd done, I think it would have been okay. To then, though, go and talk about asset leasing or asset sales, that was the step too far. That was the bit that people didn't like. People in Queensland really have an issue with that, and more than other states which have been have had far more advanced sort of programs in this sort of thing. Queenslanders clearly don't like that too much at all. And again, there's an issue there. I mean, I'll give you an example. Much to my sort of surprise, last year we had the Palaszczuk government say that they would close the Callide B coal-fired power station quite a few years early than originally planned, because they want to phase out coal, and they've got this big thing about renewables. So they actually said that they were going to, without any sort of sense of irony, that they were going to shut a power station owned by the government because of their other political objectives, where this one could have been sold to the private sector, and no doubt would have then been repurposed and continued on, I would have thought, for another 10 to 20 years. So on one hand, they're saying we're going to shut it down because it's got no value, but they sure as hell won't sell it. And so it is with a lot of the stuff in the electricity sector. These assets are unlikely to have higher values in the future than they have today. So they really are, they're assets that arguably the public sector shouldn't own. The public don't need to be involved in.
I've lived all my life in New South Wales, and when you were Premier, I was observing this heightened sensitivity of Queenslanders and the need for the government to own certain assets. Can you explain for people who don't live in Queensland why there is this why there is this attitude in Queensland that it's very important for government to own certain public utilities? Because for a lot of people who are, because for example, New South Wales and Victoria have, like you said, very advanced privatisation programs that go back 20, 25 years. So what is it about Queenslanders and public assets that politicians up in Queensland have to deal with?
Well, it is very historical and it's in the psyche. So firstly, Queensland, huge geographical area, low population density, and the history of Queensland is that government has actually had to step forward and deliver vital infrastructure and services because there would never have been delivery by the private sector. So, for example, we had an amazing rail corporation or government-owned railway, Queensland Government Railways, then Queensland Rail, which was a huge organisation, and particularly if you go back to probably its peak in terms of its network in the 1920s, 1930s, that's how you got around this state. And there are so many people whose grandpa, great uncle, great cousin, etc., have worked for the Queensland Government Railways, and it was part of the fabric of Queensland. You wanted to send a parcel to Rockhampton, it went not by truck, but it went on the railways. You went to the Roma Street rail yards, the freight, agents there, and it was dispatched there, and it was an amazing network. That's just one example. Similarly with the electricity sector, a commitment through the 60s, 70s into the 80s by the Bjelke-Petersen government to ensure people had access to the grid. So they had vast areas of the state covered by a thing called SWIR, the SWIR system, single wire earth return, to get remote properties, access to power. So this was all delivered by government. The other thing you need to know about Queensland is fundamentally it is a blue-collar, conservative state, still outside southeast Queensland with a bit of a frontier attitude. If you want to see that really today, I think you've got to go to the Northern Territory. But there's still that sense of pioneering. We're battling the elements. It's got cyclones and floods and bushfires, etc. It's a tough sort of place. I think Anna Bligh in the post-Yasi speech. And so you bring all that together, and people are really suspicious about the private sector owning these things and then gouging them or reducing services. So you then overlay, say, what's happened through the 80s and the 90s with privatisations of things like the Commonwealth, by the Commonwealth, say the Commonwealth Bank, for example. So what do people see? They see bank branches being closed in small rural and regional towns. They see other privatisations where suddenly the plane doesn't come every Tuesday morning like it used to, or it did and then it didn't and then it did again because government had to intervene. So they've seen withdrawal of services and infrastructure they consider to be vital, and they've seen stories about what's happened interstate. So Queensland was slow coming to the other party. People in Victoria saw the privatisations of the Kennett government. They've seen the Commonwealth privatisations, Keating and Howard in the 90s into the early 2000s, and I think they've then got the bad press. So long answer, but the bottom line is when Bligh went and sold off QR, that really hurt her. And frankly, more people in the LNP should have paid attention to that and the long-term political ramifications.
Yeah, very interesting. And I guess there's another factor that I want to just explore briefly, and that is, of course, interest rates are a lot lower these days than they used to be. And so there is a bit of an argument going around the traps that governments can borrow more because interest rates are so low because serviceability is easier. What's your perspective on that, Campbell?
What a great idea. Why did we think of that? If only... That was a joke. Okay. Look, that is the most crazy sort of line that I can't imagine that anybody who really knew anything about it would advocate that out there. It's incredibly irresponsible, and it's irresponsible for a range of reasons. We are now at the bottom of the interest rate sort of pricing cycle. We know that there might be some more official rate cuts, but talking to economists myself, hearing about what they can be, there's very little sort of further downward trajectory left on interest rates, official interest rates anyway. 25 to 45, maybe 50 bips. That's about it, and then you bottomed out. So they're as low as they're going to go at the bottom of the cycle. So really, they're either, if you're an optimist, you see they're going to level out for a while, and maybe we'll see this environment for a few years. But you've got to think, a more sustainable and realistic long-term position is that they're going to be at least 100, 150 basis points higher than where they are at the moment. That's my view. So they're going to be higher. The other thing, though, is the precarious nature of the Queensland economy, budget, based on its economy. I mean, Queensland is so heavily dependent on resources, tourism, international students, agriculture, and it starts to sort of disappear after that. I mean, there's not sufficient depth to the economy which you would have, say, in Victoria. And so let's just take one example, the coronavirus, and since that sort of reared its head, in the last 10 days, the spot price for LNG, our burgeoning new export industry, and our huge exporter of gas, the price has tanked, and we hear stories about purchasers of LNG actually looking to exercise force majeure clauses in contracts. This could be a really bad year for Queensland, 2020. I don't wish that on the state, but coking coal could come off, thermal coal could come off, and some of our other resources exports, again, prices could tank because of this huge hit that China's taking. And international student education, we know that sector at the moment is absolutely hemorrhaging, and similarly with tourism. So it's going to be a very tough first 6 months of this year. And so let's talk about the state budget. Immediate hit to royalties, immediate hit to payroll tax receipts, and then a lag effect where activity in the property sector maybe turns down, and they have no buffer. They absolutely have no buffer. I mean, the figures that I'm just refreshing my memory with this morning. I mean, this year, 2019, 2020, if I just check it, we're talking about a fiscal balance of minus $3.53 billion in fiscal 2019, 2020. Right now, they cannot balance the books, even though the budget now, the revenue side of the equation is now $60.4 billion. When I was the Premier, it wasn't. It was I think around $47 billion. So that's how much the state budget's expanded. The expenses have then expanded as well dramatically with all these extra public servants they've hired. So the idea that you can borrow more because interest rates are low when you've got a ongoing deficit is just crazy stuff, and that's what gets me worked up and so worried for the place.
I want to actually read you a really interesting quote. So I'm a bit of a history buff, and so there was a Scottish lawyer that was around in the 19th century, and he had something very interesting to say about what happens when you have a democracy. So I just want to go to this quote, then I'm going to ask you a question. So the quote is, so this is Alexander Tytler from 1854, quote, "A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by dictatorship." So people in the 19th century in the UK was against democracy because they said once people realize they can get something for nothing, they'll keep on voting politicians who will promise them the world. I would say that Australia is guilty of that to some degree. We're seeing that both at the state level and the federal level. So I guess the key question is do you think that the debts of Queensland and a potential debt crisis in your state, can that be resolved through the democratic ballot box, or do you think that democracy itself is actually one of the contributors to your state's problems, because the voters have effectively given the parliament license to rack up these debts?
Gee, well, look, that is a difficult one. And look, it's a great quote, and I've certainly heard it myself. I'm a bit of a history buff too, so great to bowl that one out. Look, firstly, I'm a bit of an optimist in that I think that it is possible, and I alluded to this earlier in the interview, I think it is possible for people to make a case for sorting out these issues. They have to do it better than, frankly, that I was able to do, my government was able to do. And I sort of said that at the beginning as well. So the trouble is that the Conservative side of politics has taken the wrong messages of what happened in 2015 to the Newman government. They've taken the wrong messages. The LNP in Queensland today have given up talking about this issue, for example. They don't want to put it on the table. And they're also adopting a stance where they're saying, look, we're not going to sell assets. Good luck to them if they can sustain that argument in an election campaign, because I don't know that people will necessarily believe them. So I think the way forward is to actually have people who are prepared to make some sober, sensible and tough decisions, but only take it so far. So, if I had the time again, we would make the necessary cuts to the public sector and put a real lid on spending, but I wouldn't have anything to do with the asset leasing, asset sales side of it. I think that was a step too far. But by the same token, again, losing in 2015, there's a range of factors that happened during a short, sharp election campaign. If we hadn't had Clive Palmer running a campaign against us and stopping us getting our message out, I believe we'd have won the election. If we hadn't had Alan Jones in Sydney on Talkback Radio having a huge go, and again, stopping us getting our message out, because that's what it was. I don't think he actually swung votes. What he did is he actually stopped us communicating, with people that would have enabled us to get across the line. So if he'd been removed from the equation, we would have won. It was such a narrow loss, is what I'm saying. And finally, if we had decided, well, we're not going to actually put forward this asset leasing program, or if it was far more limited, then I think we could have won. So my message is, you can do this, and we need people to have the courage to do it. You just got to do it with a bit more care and precision than we managed to achieve.
And I guess that means then, Campbell, also honesty to the public as well.
Well, look, I think you've got to. I think we need people to tell the public the facts. And it's like, ultimately, I mean, where does it go finally in Queensland? Well, I think what happens is we get to a point, and I hope this doesn't happen, but we have an economic downturn starting in China. Asset prices, the commodity prices crash, our royalty income drops, and suddenly we go from this fiscal deficit of 3.6 billion. It could go to 5.5, 6 billion a year, and suddenly it's like you've put your foot on the accelerator in terms of this ramping up debt. Then finally, the ratings agencies are looking at it seriously and going, well, you're going to be downgraded again. You're then taking an interest rate hit because there's going to be an added risk premium on it for the loan portfolio, and it just gets even worse. And then they have to actually cut services that really matter to people, and that's where it's going to hurt people. And I hope it doesn't happen, but that's what could happen given the situation at the moment. I mean, it's worse today than when I left office, and sadly, it's not a matter that is being talked about in the political sphere. You really don't hear about it. It's only covered by a few writers for, say, the Courier Mail or the Australian newspaper. But other than that, no one's dealing with the issue, and not the LNP.
Yeah, well, thank you, Campbell. And look, we really appreciate your time today, insofar that we both believe that this conversation about debt and how to manage it is probably one of the most critical conversations that should be taking place, but it's missing in action because nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah, they don't want to talk about it, and yet I'm afraid it's incumbent on our political leaders that they do.
So Campbell Newman, thank you very much for your time today. A really important message, and it's one that the interest of the people will take forward as we continue our programmes.
Thanks, Hugh. It's a pleasure.
Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.